There's a specific, sobering reality worth examining directly today, not framed as satisfying revenge fantasy, but as genuine, sobering explanation of exactly what happens, psychologically and often practically, once someone causes genuine, sustained harm to a person whose depth of feeling and depth of perception this entire series has traced extensively across dozens of previous conversations. Today we're tracing why this reality proves genuinely terrifying from the perpetrator's perspective, not because empaths seek retribution, but because of what genuine harm to genuine depth actually produces, structurally and permanently, in ways most people never anticipate before causing it. Let's start with understanding the first dimension of this reality because it explains something crucial about why this specific kind of harm proves so uniquely consequential. The first reality: an empath's memory of harm doesn't fade the way most people's memories of ordinary conflict typically do. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how genuine emotional depth includes genuinely deep, accurate encoding of significant experience. Unlike more superficial hurt that gradually softens through ordinary forgetting, harm inflicted on someone whose entire psychological architecture processes experience with this level of depth tends to remain remarkably clear, remarkably accessible, permanently available to inform every subsequent decision about who deserves continued trust and continued access. The second reality: empaths, once genuinely hurt deeply enough, develop a specific, permanent capacity to recognize the exact pattern that hurt them, considerably faster in every subsequent encounter. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about pattern recognition becoming permanent, transferable protection. Someone who genuinely deeply hurts an empath doesn't simply lose access to that specific person. They inadvertently contribute to creating someone considerably more difficult to ever successfully deceive or manipulate again, someone whose accumulated wisdom now protects not just herself, but often extends into warning and protecting others who might otherwise fall for similar patterns. The third reality: the specific quality of connection empaths offer, once lost through genuine betrayal, proves genuinely, structurally difficult to ever access again from the same source. Remember everything we've traced throughout our conversation about betraying a super empath permanently. The specific combination of factors that makes this particular kind of loss so uniquely comprehensive and so uniquely resistant to reversal. This isn't emotional exaggeration. It reflects genuine structural reality. Earned trust, once genuinely violated, doesn't simply require apology to restore. It requires a fundamentally different kind of demonstrated consistency that few people who've caused genuine harm ever successfully provide. The fourth reality, worth naming directly: empaths, once they've fully processed genuine harm, often become remarkably calm rather than remarkably reactive. And this specific calm proves considerably more unsettling to whoever caused the harm than any dramatic confrontation ever could. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how genuine indifference disorients narcissistic psychology more than anger ever could. The terrifying reality, from the perpetrator's perspective, isn't retaliation. It's the genuine, complete absence of the ongoing engagement, anger, pleading, continued attempts at reconciliation that would otherwise confirm their continued relevance and continued significance in the empath's life. Let's trace what actually happens once this specific reality genuinely fully sets in for the person who caused the harm, examining the predictable sequence that follows once they encode. Here's the first thing that typically happens: genuine, mounting disbelief that this particular relationship isn't following the pattern their previous experience has taught them to expect. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how narcissistic or otherwise harmful psychology often depends on pattern matching from previous relationships. Whoever caused genuine harm to an empath typically assumes, based on how other relationships have unfolded, that sufficient time, sufficient apology, or sufficient persistence will eventually restore access to what they've lost. This assumption proves increasingly uncomfortably wrong the longer genuine silence and genuine distance persist without ever producing the expected reversal. Here's the second thing that typically happens: gradual, genuine recognition that this specific loss carries permanence their previous relationship history never prepared them to anticipate. Remember everything we've traced throughout our conversation about the moment someone realizes he lost you forever. This recognition arrives considerably harder for anyone who has genuinely hurt an empath specifically, precisely because the qualities we've traced throughout Part 1 show permanent memory, developed pattern recognition, structural difficulty in restoring earned trust, combine to make this particular loss considerably more comprehensive and considerably more irreversible than losses experienced with people whose capacity for connection operated more superficially. Here's the third thing that typically happens: connecting extensively to everything we've traced throughout our conversation about comparison anxiety. Genuine, persistent difficulty finding anything resembling equivalent depth in subsequent relationships. Remember what we established about how the specific quality of connection an empath offers proves genuinely difficult to replicate through ordinary supply diversification. Whoever caused this harm often spends considerable time, sometimes years, encountering relationship after relationship that fails to provide the same depth, the same perception, the same generous capacity for genuine connection they once had access to and failed to adequately value or protect. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, one that addresses something genuinely important about the specific private quality of this reckoning. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the structural incapacity for sustained, genuine self-reflection that often prevents this recognition from ever fully, comprehensively developing into anything resembling complete accountability. This terrifying reality rarely produces the kind of dramatic, visible collapse that might feel satisfying to witness directly. It typically unfolds privately, incompletely, often never fully articulated even to the person experiencing it, producing genuine, ongoing discomfort that persists precisely because it never receives the full acknowledgement that might otherwise allow genuine resolution to occur. Here's the fifth thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about why this reality proves particularly terrifying in a specific, worthwhile sense. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about permanent, structural cost existing regardless of visible confirmation. What makes this reality genuinely unsettling isn't dramatic, cinematic consequence. It's the quiet, permanent, structural nature of the loss, something that cannot be undone through apology, cannot be reversed through subsequent good behavior towards someone else, cannot be repaired through any strategy available to someone whose psychological architecture never developed the capacity for the kind of sustained accountability genuine repair would actually require. Here's something crucial worth understanding about why this entire reality, terrifying as it genuinely is from the perpetrator's perspective, was never actually designed by the empath as intentional consequence or intentional punishment. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how genuine wholeness produces these effects incidentally, as natural byproduct rather than deliberate strategy. The terrifying reality of hurting an empath exists not because empaths seek to make anyone suffer for their harm, but because genuine depth, genuine perception, and genuine capacity for connection, once violated, naturally, structurally produce exactly the permanent, comprehensive cost this entire conversation has traced throughout today's discussion. And this is where the entire meaning of this experience begins to change, because eventually the story stops being about what the person who caused the harm feels, what they regret, what they remember, or whether they finally understand what they lost. Eventually, it becomes about something much more important. You. Not the version of you they remember. Not the version of you they believe might still be waiting somewhere in the past, but the version of you that exists after everything has happened. Because there is a point in genuine healing where the question changes completely. You stop asking, when will they realize what they did to me? And you start asking, why was I ever willing to accept so little from someone who had access to so much of me? That shift is everything. Because while the person who caused the harm may remain trapped inside comparison, regret, confusion, denial, or the fantasy that somehow the past can still be reopened, the empath has already entered a completely different psychological reality. The relationship may still exist in memory. The experience may still have emotional weight. The lessons may still remain, but access is gone. And there is an enormous difference between remembering someone and remaining available to them. That distinction is something harmful people often fail to understand until it is far too late. They may remember your voice. They may remember the way you listened. They may remember how easily you noticed changes in their mood that other people ignored. They may remember how you could sit with them when they were difficult to understand. They may remember the patience you gave them when they had done very little to deserve it. They may remember conversations that seemed insignificant at the time but became strangely meaningful after you were gone. And perhaps most painfully, they may eventually remember moments when you were still trying. Not because you were weak, not because you were incapable of walking away, but because at that point you genuinely believed the relationship could still become what it had the potential to be. That is what makes the loss so difficult to recreate, because they didn't simply lose your presence. They lost access to a version of you that existed only while trust still existed. And once that version of you disappears, it cannot simply be summoned back because someone finally becomes uncomfortable with its absence. This is one of the deepest misunderstandings surrounding genuine emotional healing. People sometimes believe that if enough time passes, everything becomes possible again. But time does not automatically restore trust. Sometimes time does the opposite. Sometimes time gives you enough distance to finally see what you could not clearly see while you were emotionally inside the relationship. You begin connecting moments that once seemed unrelated. You recognize patterns that once looked like isolated incidents. You understand behaviors that you previously explained away. You realize that what you called confusion was often inconsistency. What you called misunderstanding was sometimes manipulation. What you called patience was sometimes self-abandonment. And what you called love may have included an enormous amount of hope that the other person would eventually become capable of giving what they repeatedly demonstrated they could not give. That realization is painful, but it is also liberating. Because healing does not always mean forgetting what happened. Sometimes healing means remembering it without needing to return to it. And that is where the person who caused the harm loses something they may never fully understand. They no longer have the power to define your emotional reality. They cannot provoke the same reaction. They cannot pull you back into the same argument. They cannot keep you permanently explaining yourself. They cannot keep you proving that your feelings were legitimate. They cannot keep you waiting for an apology that determines whether you are allowed to move forward. Because eventually, you understand something that changes everything. Closure does not always arrive from the person who hurt you. Sometimes closure is the moment you stop needing them to understand why they hurt you. And that is an incredibly powerful transition. Because the person who caused the harm may spend years wondering whether you still think about them. You may think about them. But thinking about someone is not the same as wanting them back. You may remember the good moments. That does not erase the bad ones. You may still have compassion for what happened to them. That does not obligate you to expose yourself to what they did to you. You may understand their wounds. That does not require you to become wounded alongside them. And perhaps this is the most mature form of emotional strength. You can understand someone completely and still decide they no longer belong in your life. That is not hatred. That is discernment. And genuine discernment is something that often develops only after an empath has been forced to confront the consequences of giving too much understanding to someone who used that understanding without developing responsibility. This is why the ending of this kind of relationship can feel strangely quiet. There may be no dramatic confrontation, no final speech, no cinematic moment where the other person suddenly falls to their knees and admits everything. Real life is rarely that clean. Sometimes the final ending is simply a person sitting alone one evening and realizing they no longer feel the need to check. No need to look at the phone. No need to wonder what the other person is doing. No need to imagine what they would say if they came back. No need to rehearse imaginary conversations. No need to prove that they were wrong. No need to make them regret it. And that is when something extraordinary happens. The relationship stops being an active chapter. It becomes information, a lesson, a boundary, a piece of history, something that happened to you but no longer controls you. And this is the part that deserves the most attention. Because if someone genuinely harmed an empath, the greatest consequence was never supposed to be their suffering. It was never supposed to be revenge. It was never supposed to be making them jealous, making them chase, or creating some elaborate strategy designed to make them realize what they lost. The greatest consequence is that they eventually lose access to the person you became after surviving what they did, because you are not supposed to remain the same person after betrayal. You are supposed to become more discerning, more conscious, more selective, more protective of your energy, more aware of what consistency actually looks like, more capable of recognizing the difference between chemistry and emotional safety, between intensity and intimacy, between someone needing you and someone genuinely valuing you, between an apology and accountability, between promises and patterns. And once you learn those distinctions deeply enough, you cannot unknow them. That is the permanent transformation. The experience may have taken something from you. Perhaps it took your innocence. Perhaps it took your trust in your own judgment for a period of time. Perhaps it made you question whether your kindness had been a mistake. But eventually, if you heal properly, you discover that your kindness was never the problem. Your lack of boundaries was the part that needed to change. Your ability to love was not the weakness. Your willingness to ignore yourself while loving someone else was. And that distinction changes the entire story. Because now you don't have to become cold to become safe. You don't have to stop caring to become powerful. You don't have to become cruel because someone else was cruel to you. You simply become more discerning about who receives access to your depth. And that is perhaps the most beautiful ending possible. The empath does not win because the person who hurt them suffers. The empath wins because the person who hurt them no longer determines who they become. That is freedom. And maybe the person who caused the harm eventually understands what they lost. Maybe they don't. Maybe they understand it partially. Maybe they understand it years later. Maybe they spend a long time comparing new relationships to an old connection they failed to protect. Maybe they tell themselves a different version of the story. Maybe they never develop enough self-awareness to fully confront their responsibility. But none of that has to become your concern anymore, because your healing cannot depend on the quality of someone else's self-reflection. Their inability to understand you does not make your experience less real. Their refusal to apologize does not make the harm disappear. Their decision to move on does not mean you imagined what happened, and their eventual regret, if it ever comes, does not determine the value of what you survived. You determine that. You decide what the experience taught you. You decide what access people receive now. You decide what behavior you will never normalize again. You decide what love is allowed to look like in your life. And perhaps most importantly, you decide that being deeply loving does not mean being endlessly available. There is a version of you that once believed love meant staying. Then there is the version of you that learns sometimes love means leaving. Not because you stopped caring, but because you finally started caring about yourself with the same seriousness you once reserved for everyone else. And that is where this entire journey comes full circle. The person who hurt you may remember the empath they had, but they will never have access to that exact version of you again, because that person existed before the lesson, before the betrayal, before the pattern became visible, before your boundaries became stronger, before your perception became sharper, before you understood that not everyone who receives your depth has earned the right to remain close to it. The person standing now is different. Not harder, not heartless, not incapable of love, just awake. And once you are awake to a pattern, you stop confusing repetition with destiny. You stop believing that every connection deserves another chance simply because it once meant something. You stop reopening doors merely because someone finally knocks differently. And you stop measuring your worth by whether the person who lost you regrets losing you. Because your worth was never created by their recognition. It existed before they met you. It existed while they misunderstood you. It existed when they hurt you. And it remains completely intact after they are gone. So if there is one final truth to take from everything we've explored, let it be this. The most terrifying thing about losing a genuinely deep person is not that they will punish you. It is that they may eventually heal so completely that your absence stops being a wound in their life and becomes simply a fact of their history. They don't need to hate you. They don't need to expose you. They don't need to destroy you. They simply stop needing you. And when that happens, the relationship is no longer controlled by the person who once had the most power. It is controlled by the person who finally understood their own value. That is why genuine healing is so powerful. Because it doesn't require revenge. It doesn't require an audience. It doesn't require the other person to collapse. It doesn't even require them to understand. It only requires you to stop abandoning yourself in order to preserve something that was already destroying your peace. And when you finally do that, the story ends differently than you once imagined. You don't walk away empty. You walk away with discernment. You walk away with boundaries. You walk away knowing what your intuition sounds like when you finally stop silencing it. You walk away understanding that your sensitivity was never your enemy. Your depth was never your weakness. Your empathy was never something you needed to apologize for. You simply learned that extraordinary qualities require extraordinary boundaries. And from that moment forward, you no longer give everyone access to the deepest parts of you. You give access to people who demonstrate, through consistency, accountability, honesty, and respect, that they know how to handle what you are offering. And that is the real ending. Not their regret, not their loneliness, not their comparison, not their realization, yours. The moment you look back at the person you were and realize that you no longer need to save them, convince them, punish them, or be understood by them. You only need to keep becoming the person who would never again betray themselves just to keep someone else. Because sometimes the greatest ending is not when the person who hurt you finally realizes what they lost. Sometimes the greatest ending is when you realize what you almost lost by staying, and then you choose yourself, quietly, completely, forever. That is when the chapter truly closes, and that is when their loss finally stops being your story. It becomes theirs, and your story begins again.